My name is Dorothy Collins, and I'm 57 years old. Last Tuesday was my birthday, and my son Michael surprised me with the most beautiful box of Belgian chocolates I'd ever seen. The packaging was elegant, tied with a silk ribbon, and must have cost him a fortune. But here's the thing about getting older, you start watching your weight more carefully. So when my daughter-in-law Sharon stopped by that afternoon, I decided to give her the entire box as a gesture of kindness. I thought she'd be thrilled. Instead, when Sharon saw those chocolates, her face turned completely white, and her hands started trembling so violently she nearly dropped them. Before we dive into what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button if you're ready for a story that'll make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty, and don't forget to subscribe because this tale of betrayal and revenge is just getting started. Trust me, you won't believe what those innocent chocolates revealed about the people I trusted most. I stood there in my kitchen doorway, watching Sharon stare at that chocolate box like it contained a bomb. Her reaction made absolutely no sense to me. Sharon had always loved sweets, especially dark chocolate. In fact, just last month she'd mentioned craving some expensive Belgian truffles while we were grocery shopping together. But now she was backing away from the gift like it might bite her. "Sharon, honey, what's wrong?" I asked, reaching out to steady her. She jerked away from my touch, clutching the box against her chest. "I'm sorry, Dorothy. I just remembered I'm allergic to dark chocolate now. My doctor said I developed this new sensitivity." The excuse sounded hollow, especially since I'd never heard of anyone suddenly becoming allergic to something they'd eaten their whole life. But I didn't press the issue. Sharon had always been a bit dramatic, and I figured maybe she was having one of her moods. What bothered me more than her strange reaction was how she completely changed toward me after that day. For the past 3 years, ever since my husband passed and I moved into the small house next door to Michael and Sharon, we'd developed what I thought was a beautiful routine. Sharon would bring my twin granddaughters, Emma and Sophie, over every morning before school. They'd eat breakfast at my kitchen table while Sharon got ready for work, and I'd walk them to the bus stop. It was the highlight of my day, watching those 7-year-old girls chatter about their dreams and homework while munching on the pancakes I made special for them. But suddenly, that routine stopped. Sharon began avoiding me completely. When I knocked on their door to check if everything was okay, she'd barely crack it open, claiming they were too busy to visit. The girls would wave at me sadly from their bedroom window, pressing their little faces against the glass like prisoners. When I tried calling, Sharon would answer with short, clipped responses. "Everything's fine, Dorothy. We're just adjusting our schedule." But her voice carried an edge I'd never heard before, cold and distant. Michael noticed something was off too. During his weekly dinner visit, he kept glancing between his mother and his wife with growing concern. "Mom, you seem upset lately. Is everything all right?" I wanted to tell him about Sharon's bizarre behavior, but every time I started to explain, Sharon would jump in with some excuse about how busy they'd been or how the girls needed more structured morning routines. She made it sound like I was being needy and demanding, when all I wanted was to understand why my family was suddenly treating me like a stranger. The breaking point came when I was watering my front garden and overheard Sharon talking on her cell phone in their backyard. Her voice carried clearly over the fence, and what I heard made my blood run cold. "She knows something, Robert. We need to be more careful now. I think giving her those chocolates was a mistake." My hands started shaking so badly I dropped the watering can, sending water splashing across my roses. Robert? Who was Robert? And what did chocolates have to do with anything? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning Sharon's words over in my mind, trying to make sense of them. Finally, around 2 in the morning, I crept down to my kitchen and retrieved that chocolate box from where I'd left it on the counter. I'd been planning to save them for a special occasion, but now I needed to examine them more carefully. The box was heavier than I'd expected, made of thick cardboard with embossed gold lettering. As I lifted the lid, the scent of rich cocoa filled the air, but something else caught my attention. Tucked beneath the paper lining, partially hidden under the chocolate tray, was a small white envelope. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. The envelope was unsealed, and inside was a handwritten note on expensive cream-colored paper. The masculine handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words made my heart stop beating. My darling Sharon, happy 8-month anniversary of our first kiss. These chocolates are nothing compared to how sweet you make my life. I can't wait until we can be together openly. All my love, Robert. I read the note 3 times, each reading hitting me like a physical blow. My son had unknowingly delivered a love letter from his wife's secret lover, meant to celebrate their affair that had been going on for 8 months. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, staring at that letter and trying to process what it meant. My daughter-in-law, the woman my son loved and trusted, the mother of my precious granddaughters, had been living a complete lie for 8 months. Worse yet, she'd been using my son as an unwitting messenger, having him deliver romantic gifts from her lover. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Michael had spent his hard-earned money on what he thought was a birthday present for his mother, never knowing he was actually facilitating his wife's adultery. I thought about all the times Sharon had seemed distracted lately, all the girls' nights out, and work conferences that had become more frequent. I remembered how she'd started dressing differently, wearing more makeup and buying expensive clothes she claimed were for her new promotion at work. There had been signs, but I'd attributed them to her natural desire to look nice. Now I understood they were part of her deception, her way of looking attractive for this Robert person while she systematically betrayed my son. By the time the sun came up, I'd made my decision. I had to confront Sharon directly. This wasn't something I could ignore or hope would resolve itself. My son deserved to know the truth, and those little girls deserved better than a mother who could lie so effortlessly. I waited until Michael left for his job at the construction company, then walked over to their house. My heart pounded as I knocked on the door, clutching the love letter in my sweaty palm. Sharon answered wearing a silk robe I'd never seen before, her hair perfectly styled even though it was only 8 in the morning. When she saw me standing there with the letter visible in my hand, all the color drained from her face. "Dorothy, what are you doing here so early?" Her voice was higher than usual, strained with barely concealed panic. I held up the letter, watching as her eyes darted around frantically, probably calculating how to handle this confrontation. "We need to talk, Sharon. About this letter. About Robert. About what you're doing to my son." I tried to keep my voice calm and steady, but anger was building in my chest like a furnace. Sharon's expression shifted from panic to something harder, more calculating. She stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind her, glancing around to make sure none of the neighbors could hear us. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Dorothy. That letter isn't mine. I don't know any Robert. Maybe you're confused because of your age." Her denial was swift and practiced, but the accusation about my age stung like a slap. She was trying to make me doubt my own perception, suggesting that being 57 meant I was somehow mentally unreliable. "I know what I read, Sharon. This letter was hidden in the chocolate box Michael gave me. The same box that made you turn white as a sheet." Sharon's facade cracked for just a moment, and I saw genuine fear flash across her features. But then she composed herself, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold as winter. "You're having some kind of episode, Dorothy. Maybe you should see a doctor. Michael's been worried about you lately, you know. He thinks you're becoming paranoid and making up stories for attention." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. She was already poisoning my son against me, planting seeds of doubt about my mental state. "I'm not making anything up. This letter proves you're having an affair." I waved the paper at her, but Sharon lunged forward and snatched it from my hand. "You're not taking this to Michael. You're not destroying my family with your delusions." She tore the letter into tiny pieces right in front of me, letting the fragments flutter to the ground like snow. "There. Now there's no letter. Just an old woman's imagination." I bent down frantically, trying to gather the pieces, but Sharon stepped on my hands, grinding the paper fragments under her heel. "Stay away from my family, Dorothy. Michael doesn't need his mother filling his head with crazy stories. Maybe it's time you considered moving to one of those nice assisted living places where they can keep an eye on you." The threat was clear, and the malice in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just about hiding an affair anymore. Sharon was declaring war on me, using my son's love and concern as weapons against me. That afternoon, when Michael came home from work, Sharon was ready for him. I watched from my kitchen window as she met him in their driveway, gesturing animatedly while she talked. Even from a distance, I could see her wiping fake tears from her eyes, playing the role of the concerned wife dealing with a difficult mother-in-law. When Michael glanced toward my house, his expression was troubled and uncertain. Sharon had gotten to him first, and whatever story she'd told him was already taking root in his mind. That evening, Michael knocked on my door with a forced smile and worried eyes. "Mom, Sharon told me you had kind of a rough morning. She's concerned about you. Maybe we should talk about getting you checked out by a doctor, just to make sure everything's okay upstairs." He tapped his temple gently, the way you'd talk to a child or someone you thought might be losing their grip on reality. My own son was looking at me like I was fragile and confused, and I realized with growing horror that Sharon's plan was already working. Within a week, Sharon had transformed from my ally into my greatest enemy, and she was methodically turning my entire family against me. Her first recruit was Michael's sister Lisa, who lived across town but visited regularly. Lisa had always been impressionable and eager to please, the type of person who believed whatever the last person told her. When Sharon called Lisa with concerns about Dorothy's declining mental state, Lisa accepted every word without question. "Dorothy's been acting really strange lately," Sharon explained during their phone conversation, which I inadvertently overheard when Lisa called me afterward. "She's making up stories about finding letters that don't exist. She's becoming paranoid and aggressive. Michael's worried sick about her." Lisa's response was predictably sympathetic. "Oh no, that's terrible. Poor Michael, having to deal with this stress. And you're such a saint for being patient with her." The next thing I knew, Lisa was calling me with suggestions about getting help. She used that careful, patronizing tone people reserve for children and the mentally impaired. "Dorothy, honey, Sharon mentioned you've been feeling a bit overwhelmed lately. There's no shame in needing support. Maybe you should see someone, just to talk through whatever's bothering you." When I tried to explain about the letter and Sharon's affair, Lisa's voice became even more gentle and condescending. "Now Dorothy, you know Sharon loves Michael. These kinds of thoughts aren't healthy." Sharon's next strategic move was scheduling a doctor's appointment for me, presenting it as a routine checkup but privately briefing the physician beforehand. She called Dr. Martinez's office and spoke to him directly, painting a picture of an elderly woman experiencing paranoid delusions and aggressive behavior. "She's been accusing me of having an affair," Sharon told him, her voice heavy with false concern. "She claims to have found evidence that doesn't exist. Yesterday she got very agitated when I couldn't produce this imaginary letter she insists she saw." When the appointment day arrived, Sharon insisted on driving me and staying for the consultation. For moral support, she claimed, but I knew she wanted to control the narrative. Dr. Martinez, a kind man in his 60s whom I'd trusted for years, had clearly been influenced by Sharon's preliminary conversation. Instead of asking about my physical health, he focused immediately on my mental state. "Dorothy, Sharon tells me you've been experiencing some confusion lately. Are you having trouble distinguishing between reality and imagination?" His questions were loaded with Sharon's poison, designed to make me sound unstable no matter how I answered. When I tried to explain about the affair and the love letter, he exchanged meaningful glances with Sharon, as if to say, "See what I mean?" "Sometimes as we age, our minds can play tricks on us," Dr. Martinez explained gently. "Stress and isolation can make us see patterns that aren't really there. Have you been feeling lonely since your husband passed?" Everything I said in defense of my sanity was twisted into evidence of my supposed decline. When I insisted the letter had been real, he nodded sympathetically and made notes about persistent delusions. When I mentioned Sharon's changed behavior toward me, he characterized it as paranoid thinking about family members. By the end of the appointment, Dr. Martinez was prescribing mild sedatives to help with anxiety and agitation. Sharon played her part perfectly, acting like the devoted daughter-in-law who was sacrificing her own well-being to care for a difficult relative. "I just want what's best for Dorothy," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "This has been so hard on Michael and the girls." The medication was just the beginning of Sharon's campaign to discredit me. A few days later, she introduced her secret weapon, Robert himself, though not as her lover. She brought him to a family barbecue as her cousin Robert from Phoenix, who was visiting for a few weeks and helping them organize their finances. Robert was a smooth-talking man in his 40s, handsome in a slick way, with expensive clothes and a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Dorothy, I'd like you to meet my cousin Robert," Sharon said sweetly, as if she wasn't introducing me to the man who'd been destroying my son's marriage. "He's been such a help with our investment planning." Robert shook my hand with a firm grip, looking me straight in the eye without a trace of shame or recognition. "It's so nice to meet Michael's mother. Sharon's told me wonderful things about you." The audacity was breathtaking. Here was the man who'd been carrying on an affair with my daughter-in-law, sitting at my son's picnic table, eating Michael's grilled burgers while planning how to steal his wife. But I was trapped by Sharon's previous manipulation. If I accused this cousin of being Sharon's lover, I'd sound even more delusional and paranoid. Sharon had positioned herself perfectly, using Robert's presence as further proof of my supposed mental instability. Throughout that terrible afternoon, I watched Robert inserting himself into family conversations about money and future plans. He asked detailed questions about property values, retirement savings, and insurance policies. When Michael mentioned some financial documents he needed help organizing, Robert immediately volunteered his expertise. "I'd be happy to take a look at your portfolio," he offered. "Sometimes an outside perspective can spot opportunities you might miss." The most chilling moment came when I saw Robert handling Michael's checkbook, supposedly helping him balance his accounts. This stranger had access to my son's financial information while my son remained completely oblivious to the danger. When I tried to express concern to Michael privately, he dismissed my worries with growing impatience. "Mom, you're being paranoid again. Robert's family, and he's got a degree in financial planning. He's trying to help us." But the worst betrayal was still to come. As the evening wound down, Michael pulled me aside for what I thought would be a heart-to-heart conversation. Instead, he delivered news that felt like a dagger to my heart. "Mom, Sharon and I have been talking, and we think maybe you shouldn't be living alone anymore. We're worried about you, especially after what Dr. Martinez said about your episodes." Episodes. That's what they were calling my attempts to expose Sharon's lies. My own son was using medical terminology to dismiss my legitimate concerns, and I realized with growing horror that Sharon's plan was working perfectly. She was systematically isolating me from my family while positioning herself as the caring daughter-in-law dealing with a difficult, unstable mother-in-law. And now she was using my son's love and concern as weapons to attack my independence and credibility. Over the following weeks, my world continued to shrink as Sharon's manipulation grew more sophisticated. What I initially thought was just an affair had revealed itself as something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated plan to take control of family assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The pieces began falling into place when I decided to conduct my own investigation, using skills I'd developed during 30 years as a high school librarian researching complex topics. My first breakthrough came when I visited the county clerk's office to research property records. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Sharon had been quietly filing paperwork to add Robert's name to various family documents, claiming he was helping with estate planning consultation. She'd listed him as a financial advisor on forms that would give him legal access to information about property values, mortgage details, and insurance policies. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Henderson, was an old friend who'd worked there for decades. "Dorothy, I remember when you and your husband bought that house," she said, pulling up records on her computer. "But I have to tell you, there's been a lot of activity on your son's property lately. Your daughter-in-law has been here several times with this man claiming to be a financial consultant. They've requested copies of deeds, tax assessments, even information about your late husband's estate settlement." The pattern was becoming clear. Sharon wasn't just having an affair, she was systematically gathering information needed to steal everything my family had worked for. When I dug deeper into Robert's background, the picture became even more frightening. Using the internet connection at the local library, I discovered that Robert Martinez wasn't from Phoenix at all. His real name was Robert Castellanos, and he had a criminal record spanning 3 states. He'd been convicted of elder fraud in Colorado, identity theft in Nevada, and investment fraud in California. This wasn't some romantic affair that had gotten out of hand, this was a professional con artist targeting my family's wealth through Sharon. The scope of their scheme became apparent when I found financial documents that Sharon had carelessly left in Michael's car. While he was at work, I used my spare key to retrieve papers she'd been hiding in his glove compartment. What I found was a detailed analysis of family assets, including the value of Michael's house, my property, life insurance policies, and even my late husband's pension benefits that I still received. They'd calculated that the total family wealth was approximately $420,000, not including potential inheritance from my eventual passing. Most disturbing were handwritten notes in Sharon's recognizable script outlining their timeline. Phase 1. Establish Robert's credibility as family friend and financial advisor. Phase 2. Document Dorothy's mental decline and push for guardianship transfer. Phase 3. Convince Michael to consolidate accounts for easier management. Phase 4. Transfer assets to secure accounts Robert controls. They weren't just planning to steal money, they were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could control everything legally. The medical aspect of their plan was particularly insidious. Dr. Martinez, it turned out, had been given false information about my mental state, but Sharon was also secretly increasing my medication dosage. I discovered this when I found duplicate prescription bottles in her purse, both with my name but different dosage instructions. She'd been crushing extra pills into my coffee during the few visits I'd allowed her, making me genuinely drowsy and confused to support her claims about my declining mental state. Meanwhile, Robert was working on Michael from another angle, gradually convincing him that consolidating family finances would protect everyone from potential problems. "Your mother's getting older, Michael," he'd say during their man-to-man conversations. "What happens if she has a serious medical emergency or needs expensive care? If all the assets are scattered in different accounts and properties, it'll be a nightmare to manage. I've seen families torn apart by this kind of financial chaos." Michael, trusting and concerned about his mother's apparent decline, was receptive to these suggestions. He'd already started talking about putting both properties under a single trust, with Sharon as the primary beneficiary and Robert as the financial advisor. In their minds, they were protecting family assets from an increasingly unstable elderly woman. In reality, they were signing everything over to criminals who planned to disappear once the transfers were complete. The cruelest part of their plan involved my granddaughters. Sharon had been coaching Emma and Sophie to report concerns about grandma's forgetfulness and scary behavior. When I tried to visit them, the girls would recite obviously rehearsed lines about how I'd said confusing things or forgotten important details. Sharon was using my beloved grandchildren as witnesses against me, training them to support her lies about my mental state. I reached my breaking point when I discovered that Sharon had already contacted Sunset Manor, an expensive nursing home across town, and put me on their waiting list for emergency placement. She'd told them I was becoming violent and unpredictable, requiring immediate institutionalization for everyone's safety. The intake coordinator had been led to believe that my family was desperately seeking help for an elderly woman who could no longer function independently. That night, sitting alone in my kitchen with all the evidence spread across my table, I felt more isolated and hopeless than I'd ever been in my life. My son thought I was losing my mind. My daughter-in-law was systematically destroying my reputation while planning to steal everything I owned. A career criminal had infiltrated my family and gained access to our most private financial information. Even my own granddaughters had been turned against me. I felt like I was drowning in quicksand, with every struggle only pulling me deeper into Sharon's carefully constructed web of lies. But as I stared at those documents, something inside me shifted. I was 57 years old, not 97. I had all my mental faculties, 30 years of experience as a researcher, and nothing left to lose. If Sharon wanted to play games with my family's future, she was about to discover that this grandmother was far from helpless. The war she'd started was about to become a battle she couldn't win. My decision to fight back began at 6:30 the next morning when I called Michael and asked him to meet me for breakfast at our usual diner downtown. "I need to show you something important," I told him, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Please come alone. This is about protecting your family." Michael agreed, though I could hear the weariness in his voice. He thought he was humoring his increasingly difficult mother, but I was preparing to save his life from destruction. I arrived early and organized all my evidence in a manila folder. Photocopies of Robert's criminal record, the financial documents I'd found in Michael's car, pictures I'd taken of the prescription bottles with different dosages, and a detailed timeline of Sharon's lies. My hands shook as I arranged everything in chronological order, knowing this might be my last chance to reach my son before Sharon's manipulation became irreversible. When Michael walked into the diner, he looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his shoulders slumped with the weight of stress he'd been carrying. "Mom, I hope this isn't going to be another conspiracy theory about Sharon," he said as he slid into the booth across from me. "I can't handle much more drama right now." The fact that he viewed my legitimate concerns as drama showed how thoroughly Sharon had poisoned his mind against me. I started with Robert's criminal record, sliding the printed pages across the table. "Michael, I need you to look at this very carefully. This man is not Sharon's cousin. His real name is Robert Castellanos, and he's a convicted con artist who specializes in elder fraud." Michael barely glanced at the papers before pushing them back toward me. "Mom, please. You can't just print random things off the internet and claim they're about Robert. This is exactly what Dr. Martinez was worried about." But I persisted, showing him the financial documents with Sharon's handwritten notes about their timeline for stealing family assets. "Look at your wife's handwriting, Michael. Look at how they've calculated the value of everything we own." For a moment, I saw doubt flicker in his eyes as he recognized Sharon's distinctive script. But then he shook his head firmly. "These could be notes for anything. Maybe she's helping him with his own financial planning. You're interpreting innocent things in the worst possible way." When I produced the evidence about the medication tampering, showing him photographs of the duplicate prescription bottles, Michael's face hardened with anger. But the anger wasn't directed at Sharon, it was aimed squarely at me. "Mom, this is insane. Are you seriously accusing my wife of trying to poison you? Do you realize how crazy that sounds?" He stood up from the table, his voice rising loud enough that other diners began staring. "I can't do this anymore. You need professional help." My final desperate attempt was playing an audio recording I'd made the previous day using my old cassette recorder hidden in my purse. Sharon's voice came through clearly as she spoke to someone on the phone. "Robert's worried that Michael's getting suspicious about the money transfers. We might need to move faster than planned." But instead of vindicating me, the recording seemed to push Michael over the edge. "You've been secretly recording my wife?" His voice was filled with disgust and disbelief. "Mom, this is harassment. This is stalking behavior. I think Sharon's right about needing to protect our family from this kind of paranoid obsession." He gathered up all my evidence and shoved it back across the table. "I'm taking Sharon and the girls somewhere safe until you get help. Don't contact us again until you've seen a psychiatrist." Michael stormed out of the diner, leaving me sitting alone with my untouched coffee and my pile of rejected evidence. Other customers were whispering and pointing, clearly viewing me as the unstable old woman who'd just had a public breakdown. I felt the walls of Sharon's trap closing around me, cutting off my access to my son and grandchildren while positioning me as the aggressor in a situation where I was actually the victim. 3 days later, a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door with legal papers that made my worst fears official. Sharon had filed for a restraining order against me, claiming I'd been harassing her with false accusations, secretly recording conversations, and making threats against her safety. The petition described me as an increasingly unstable elderly woman showing signs of paranoid delusions and aggressive behavior toward family members. Reading those legal documents was like watching my life being systematically dismantled by professional liars. Every attempt I'd made to expose Sharon's deception had been reframed as evidence of my mental instability. My research into Robert's background became obsessive stalking behavior. My discovery of their financial planning became paranoid fantasies about theft. Even my audio recording was presented as proof of my deteriorating mental state and inability to respect others' privacy. The restraining order prohibited me from contacting Sharon directly, approaching within 500 feet of their home, or attempting to see my granddaughters without supervised visitation. Most devastating of all, it gave Sharon temporary authority to make decisions about my medical care if I was found to be incapacitated or unable to make rational decisions. She'd essentially gained legal control over my life while painting herself as the long-suffering victim of an elderly woman's mental decline. That afternoon, neighbors watched from their windows as the sheriff served me papers in my own front yard. Mrs. Patterson from across the street later told me she'd heard through the neighborhood gossip network that I was losing my mind and threatening people. Sharon's version of events was spreading through our small community like wildfire, turning me into the local crazy lady that children would probably be warned to avoid. The isolation was immediate and crushing. Michael changed the locks on his house and installed security cameras facing my property. When I tried calling his cell phone, I discovered he'd blocked my number. Lisa, fully convinced by Sharon's narrative, left angry voicemails telling me to leave that poor woman alone and get help before you hurt someone. Even my weekly cleaning lady stopped coming, claiming she felt uncomfortable working for someone who was having problems. That evening, sitting in my empty house with legal papers scattered across my coffee table, I realized Sharon had achieved something truly diabolical. She'd managed to use my love for my family as a weapon against me. Every attempt I'd made to protect Michael and the girls had been twisted into evidence of my unfitness as a mother and grandmother. She'd isolated me from everyone who mattered while positioning herself as the reasonable adult dealing with a difficult situation. But as I stared at those restraining order documents, I felt something unexpected stirring in my chest. It wasn't despair or defeat, it was a cold, calculating anger that reminded me of the woman I'd been before marriage and motherhood softened my edges. Sharon thought she'd won by getting the legal system on her side, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd given me absolutely nothing left to lose, and that made me more dangerous than she could possibly imagine. The next morning, I was in my garden trying to find some peace among my roses when Mrs. Henderson from next door appeared at the fence separating our properties. Eleanor Henderson was 72 years old, a retired school principal with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. She'd been watching the drama unfold with growing concern, and now she had information that would change everything. "Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me butting in, but I need to tell you something important," Eleanor said, glancing around to make sure we couldn't be overheard. "That man Sharon's been calling her cousin? I've seen him before." She leaned closer to the fence, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Last year, he tried to convince my friend Martha Reynolds to invest her life savings in some fake certificate program. Martha's daughter is a police detective, and she ran a background check. The man's a professional con artist." The relief I felt hearing someone else validate my concerns was overwhelming. For weeks, I'd begun questioning my own sanity as everyone around me insisted I was imagining things. But Eleanor had independently identified Robert as a threat, confirming that my instincts had been correct all along. "Mrs. Henderson, I have evidence about what they're planning, but nobody will listen to me. My own son thinks I'm losing my mind." Eleanor's expression grew grim as I explained about the financial documents, the medication tampering, and the systematic isolation I'd been experiencing. As a former educator, she recognized the signs of psychological manipulation that I'd been too emotionally involved to identify clearly. "Dorothy, what you're describing is called gaslighting. They're making you doubt your own perceptions by insisting that obvious reality isn't real. It's a classic technique used by abusers and con artists." That afternoon, Eleanor introduced me to her grandson Jake, a 25-year-old computer programmer who worked from home. Jake had been watching the drama unfold from his grandmother's house and had his own suspicions about Robert. "I saw that guy going through Mr. Michael's car one day when everyone was at work," he told me. "He was taking pictures of documents with his phone. That seemed weird for a financial advisor who was supposedly just helping organize paperwork." Jake offered to help me recover deleted files from Michael's computer using advanced data recovery software. "If this Robert guy has been using your son's computer to access financial accounts or communicate with accomplices, there might be evidence in the deleted files or browser history." We waited until Michael left for work the next day, then Jake used his technical skills to examine the laptop Michael kept in his home office. What we discovered was a goldmine of evidence that confirmed my worst fears. Robert had been using Michael's computer to research identity theft techniques, offshore banking procedures, and legal methods for gaining conservatorship over elderly family members. His browser history showed visits to websites about forging medical documents and manipulating prescription medications. Most damning of all, we found deleted emails between Robert and Sharon discussing specific dates for Phase 2 and Phase 3 of their plan. Jake also recovered chat logs showing that Robert had been in contact with other con artists, sharing information about the Phoenix job, and discussing how to accelerate the timeline if the old lady becomes too much trouble. The messages revealed that this wasn't just about stealing money, it was about completely destroying my family's financial security and then disappearing before anyone realized what had happened. Armed with this new evidence, I hired a private investigator recommended by Eleanor's daughter, who worked in law enforcement. Detective Ray Morrison was a retired police officer who specialized in financial fraud cases. When I showed him everything Jake had recovered, plus my original documentation about Robert's criminal history, his reaction was immediate and professional. "Mrs. Collins, you're dealing with a sophisticated criminal enterprise," Detective Morrison explained during our meeting at his office. "This Robert Castellanos has pulled similar scams in at least 5 states, usually targeting families with elderly members who have substantial assets. The pattern is always the same: infiltrate the family through a romantic relationship, isolate the elderly family member by questioning their mental state, then gain legal control of assets through fraudulent guardianship proceedings." Detective Morrison agreed to conduct a comprehensive investigation into Robert's activities and Sharon's involvement. Within a week, he'd uncovered evidence of forged documents, fraudulent financial applications, and communications with other criminals. He also discovered that Sharon had opened secret bank accounts and had been transferring money from Michael's accounts in small amounts that wouldn't immediately trigger bank fraud alerts. The most shocking revelation came when Detective Morrison investigated Sharon's background more thoroughly. "Your daughter-in-law isn't who she claims to be either," he told me during our follow-up meeting. "Her real name is Sharon Valdez, and she's got a history of involvement with confidence schemes targeting men with assets. She met Robert Castellanos in Nevada 2 years ago, and they've been partners in at least 3 previous frauds." But even as I was gathering this overwhelming evidence of criminal activity, the psychological warfare against me was intensifying. My own brother Frank, who lived 2 hours away but stayed in regular contact with our family, called to express his concerns about my deteriorating condition. It became clear that Sharon had been feeding him the same lies she'd told everyone else, but Frank's betrayal hurt more than most because I'd trusted him to see through her manipulation. "Dorothy, Lisa's really worried about you," Frank said during what I'd hoped would be a supportive phone call. "She says you've been making up stories about Sharon and causing a lot of family drama. Maybe it's time to consider getting some professional help." The fact that my own brother was now questioning my sanity, based entirely on Sharon's poison, showed how completely she'd corrupted my family relationships. The breaking point came when I discovered that Frank had been providing Sharon with information about my personal finances, thinking he was helping Michael manage my affairs during my supposed mental decline. He'd given her access to details about my checking account, my mortgage payments, and even my late husband's insurance policies. Without realizing it, my brother had become another tool in Sharon's scheme to steal everything I owned. That night, as I sat in my living room surrounded by evidence that would prove my innocence and their guilt, I realized something important had changed inside me. I was no longer the passive victim trying to convince people to believe me. I was a woman with a mission, supported by competent allies, armed with irrefutable proof, and ready to take down the criminals who'd infiltrated my family. Sharon and Robert thought they were dealing with a confused old lady, but they were about to face a grandmother who'd learned how to fight dirty when her family's survival was at stake. With Detective Morrison's investigation providing rock-solid evidence and Eleanor Henderson's support giving me emotional strength, I began executing a carefully planned counterattack designed to expose Sharon and Robert's criminal enterprise. But this time, I wasn't going to make the mistake of confronting them directly or trying to convince people who'd already been manipulated. Instead, I was going to use their own tactics against them: careful documentation, strategic timing, and psychological pressure. My first target was Michael's growing doubt about their financial advisor. Detective Morrison had provided me with detailed information about Robert's previous victims, including contact information for families he'd defrauded in other states. With Jake's help, I created a comprehensive digital presentation showing Robert's criminal history, complete with court documents, victim statements, and photographs proving his identity across multiple states. Rather than confronting Michael directly with this evidence, I decided to plant seeds of doubt that would grow naturally. I asked Eleanor to mention casually during a conversation with Michael that she'd heard concerning rumors about financial advisors who prey on families. Jake, accidentally, left printed articles about elder fraud on Michael's windshield, making it look like community awareness materials being distributed to all residents. The psychological pressure on Sharon was more direct. I began documenting her activities with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case, because that's exactly what I was doing. Every time she left the house, I noted the time and took photographs. When Robert visited, I recorded license plate numbers and documented how long he stayed. I wanted them to feel watched and hunted, the same way they'd made me feel trapped and isolated. Detective Morrison coached me on legal methods for gathering evidence that would hold up in court. We installed a security camera system at Eleanor's house that provided clear views of Sharon and Robert's activities at Michael's property. When they realized they were being monitored, their behavior became noticeably more paranoid and erratic, which actually helped our case by making them appear suspicious to neighbors. Meanwhile, Jake was conducting sophisticated digital surveillance of their online activities. Using techniques that were perfectly legal but highly effective, he tracked Robert's internet presence and discovered communications with other criminals planning similar scams in different cities. We learned that Sharon and Robert had a timeline for completing their theft and disappearing by Christmas, just 2 months away. The most crucial element of my counterattack was rebuilding relationships with people Sharon had poisoned against me. Starting with neighbors who'd known me for years, I began quietly sharing the truth about what was happening. Mrs. Patterson from across the street, who'd initially believed Sharon's lies about my mental decline, changed her tune completely when I showed her documented evidence of Robert's criminal history. "Dorothy, I feel terrible for doubting you," she said after reviewing Detective Morrison's findings. "That woman had me convinced you were having some kind of breakdown. But this proves you've been protecting your family all along." Word began spreading through the neighborhood that the real threat wasn't the crazy grandmother, but the criminals who'd infiltrated a local family. My brother Frank was harder to reach because Sharon had been feeding him lies for months, but I had an advantage. I knew Frank better than Sharon did. Frank had always prided himself on being a practical, logical man who made decisions based on facts rather than emotions. When I called him with specific documentation about Robert's criminal convictions and Sharon's false identity, his attitude shifted dramatically. "Jesus Christ, Dorothy, why didn't you lead with this information?" he said after I emailed him copies of court documents and police reports. "I thought you were making wild accusations, but this is documented criminal activity." Frank's support was crucial because he carried weight with other family members who'd been influenced by Sharon's manipulation. The breakthrough moment came when Detective Morrison helped me set up a controlled encounter designed to record Sharon and Robert discussing their criminal plans. Using equipment provided by law enforcement contacts, we created a situation where Sharon would feel safe talking openly about her scheme. Eleanor invited Sharon for coffee, claiming she was concerned about family tensions and wanted to help mediate. During that recorded conversation, Sharon revealed far more than she intended. Thinking she was talking to a sympathetic neighbor who believed her lies about my mental instability, Sharon complained freely about how difficult it was to manage Dorothy's paranoid episodes, while helping Michael organize his finances. She admitted that Robert had been instrumental in getting Dorothy under control, and that they were working toward a permanent solution that would be best for everyone. Most damning of all, Sharon bragged about how easy it had been to convince Dr. Martinez that I was having mental health issues. "Doctors always believe younger family members over older patients," she said with obvious satisfaction. "Once you plant the idea that someone's becoming senile, everything they say gets discounted as confusion or paranoia. It's the perfect way to discredit someone without actually having to prove they're wrong." Jake used sophisticated audio enhancement software to create crystal-clear copies of Sharon's admissions, while Detective Morrison verified that the recordings would be admissible as evidence in both criminal and civil proceedings. We now had documented proof of conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, identity theft, and manipulation of medical professionals for criminal purposes. But our most powerful weapon was still to come. Detective Morrison had been working with law enforcement contacts in Nevada and California to coordinate arrests of other members of Robert's criminal network. When those arrests happened, we'd have leverage to pressure Robert into revealing the full scope of his partnership with Sharon and their plans for my family's assets. As I reviewed all the evidence we'd gathered, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. Sharon and Robert thought they were dealing with an isolated, discredited old woman, but they were actually facing a coalition of allies armed with professional-grade evidence and legal authority. Their own arrogance and overconfidence had led them to reveal information that would destroy them completely. The final phase of my counterattack was about to begin, and this time I held all the cards. The moment of truth arrived on a crisp October morning when Detective Morrison called to inform me that Robert's criminal associates had been arrested in Nevada, providing us with the leverage we needed to force a final confrontation. "Mrs. Collins, it's time to bring this to a head," he said. "We have enough evidence to file charges, but I want to give your son a chance to see the truth before this becomes a public criminal case." I called Michael that evening, using my most calm and reasonable voice to request a family meeting. "Michael, I know you're upset with me, but I have information about your family's safety that you need to hear. Please bring Sharon and let me present everything I've learned. After that, if you still think I'm wrong, I'll accept whatever you decide about my place in your lives." The desperation in my voice must have reached him because he agreed to meet the next evening. Eleanor Henderson's living room became our courtroom, neutral territory where Michael and Sharon would feel safe while I presented my case. Detective Morrison agreed to be present as an independent authority, while Jake prepared a digital presentation that would make the evidence impossible to deny. I spent the afternoon organizing everything in chronological order, from Robert's criminal background to Sharon's admission of deliberately undermining my credibility. When Michael and Sharon arrived, the tension was immediately apparent. Sharon's confidence had been shaken by weeks of feeling watched and investigated, while Michael looked exhausted from months of trying to manage what he thought was his mother's mental decline. "Mom, I hope this isn't another attempt to convince me that Sharon's some kind of criminal mastermind," he said wearily as they settled onto Eleanor's couch. I started with Detective Morrison's introduction, establishing his credentials as a retired police officer with expertise in financial fraud. The weight of official authority immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. This wasn't a confused grandmother making wild accusations, this was a professional investigator presenting documented evidence of criminal activity. "Mr. Collins, your family has been targeted by a sophisticated criminal enterprise," Detective Morrison began, opening a thick folder of evidence. "The man you know as Robert, your wife's cousin, is actually Robert Castellanos, a convicted con artist with victims in 5 states. He placed Robert's criminal record on the coffee table, complete with mugshots and court documents that proved his identity beyond question." Sharon's face had gone completely white, but she tried to maintain her composure. "This is ridiculous," she said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Robert is my cousin from Phoenix. This is just another one of Dorothy's paranoid fantasies." But when Detective Morrison produced evidence of Robert's real identity, including fingerprint matches and social security records, her denials became increasingly desperate. Michael stared at the documents with growing shock, finally understanding that his mother's concerns hadn't been delusions. "But Sharon, you said he was your cousin. How do you explain this?" His voice carried the pain of someone realizing he'd been systematically deceived by the person he trusted most. The moment of truth came when I played the audio recording of Sharon admitting to her manipulation tactics. Her own voice filled Eleanor's living room, bragging about how easy it had been to convince everyone that I was mentally unstable. Doctors always believe younger family members over older patients. Once you plant the idea that someone's becoming senile, everything they say gets discounted as confusion or paranoia. Michael's expression shifted from confusion to horrified realization as he heard his wife casually discussing her systematic destruction of his mother's credibility. "Sharon, is this really your voice? Did you really say these things?" His question was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the nightmare more real. Sharon's final desperate gambit was to claim that the recordings were fake, manufactured by me to frame her for crimes she hadn't committed. But Detective Morrison had anticipated this defense. Jake's technical analysis proved the recordings were authentic, while additional evidence showed Sharon's fingerprints on documents she'd claimed never to have seen. The breaking point came when Detective Morrison revealed that Sharon's real name was Sharon Valdez and that she'd been partners with Robert in previous fraud schemes. "Your wife has been living under a false identity since before you met her," he explained to Michael. "Everything about your relationship has been part of a long-term plan to steal your family's assets." Michael turned to stare at the woman he'd married and trusted with his children's future. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice broken with betrayal and disbelief. "If your name isn't even Sharon, then who the hell have I been married to for 8 years?" The pain in his voice was devastating, but I felt no satisfaction in his suffering. This was my son learning that his entire adult life had been built on lies. When confronted with overwhelming evidence and no remaining options for denial, Sharon's careful facade finally cracked completely. The sweet, concerned daughter-in-law disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating who'd been hiding behind a mask for years. "You stupid people have no idea how good you had it," she snarled at Michael. "I gave you 8 years of marriage and 2 beautiful daughters. I made you happy, didn't I? What does it matter what my real name is?" But Michael was past the point of being manipulated by someone who'd spent years lying to him about everything. "It matters because none of it was real," he said, standing up and moving away from her as if she were contaminated. "Our marriage, our family, even our children, you were planning to steal everything and disappear. How long before you would have taken Emma and Sophie and vanished?" The revelation that Sharon had intended to kidnap my granddaughters was the final straw. Any remaining sympathy Michael might have felt for his wife evaporated when he realized she'd been prepared to destroy his children's lives as part of her criminal scheme. Detective Morrison had uncovered evidence suggesting Sharon and Robert planned to take the girls out of state, making it nearly impossible for Michael to regain custody. As Sharon realized her situation was hopeless, she made one last desperate attempt to escape consequences by threatening everyone in the room. "You have no idea what Robert's capable of when he's cornered," she said, her voice filled with genuine menace. "He doesn't like leaving loose ends, and you've all become very inconvenient loose ends." The threat sent chills through the room, but Detective Morrison calmly explained that Robert was already in federal custody, arrested that morning for violating parole conditions related to his previous convictions. The confrontation ended with Detective Morrison calling local police to arrest Sharon for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. As officers led her away in handcuffs, she screamed accusations and threats at everyone present, finally showing her true nature after years of careful deception. Michael watched his wife being arrested with an expression of numb shock, as if he were observing someone else's nightmare rather than living his own. The weeks following Sharon's arrest were a blur of legal proceedings, family reconciliation, and gradual healing from months of psychological warfare. Robert Castellanos was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for multiple counts of fraud and identity theft, while Sharon received 8 years for her role in the conspiracy. The judge specifically noted the particularly cruel and calculating nature of their crimes against elderly victims and their own family members. Financial recovery took several months, but Detective Morrison's thorough investigation helped us reclaim almost everything Sharon and Robert had stolen. The secret bank accounts were frozen and their contents returned to our family, while insurance policies and property deeds were restored to their rightful ownership. Michael had to rebuild his credit rating and change all his financial accounts, but the damage could have been catastrophic if their scheme had proceeded to completion. More important than money was rebuilding the trust and relationships that Sharon's manipulation had nearly destroyed. Michael struggled with guilt over doubting me and allowing his wife to systematically undermine my credibility. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said during one of our many reconciliation conversations. "I should have listened to you from the beginning. I should have trusted my own mother over someone who turned out to be a complete stranger." The process of forgiveness was complicated by my own anger over months of isolation and character assassination. Michael's doubt and rejection had genuinely hurt me, but I understood that he'd been as much a victim of Sharon's manipulation as I had been. Professional counseling helped us work through the complex emotions surrounding betrayal, forgiveness, and rebuilding family bonds that had been deliberately damaged by criminal manipulation. My granddaughters, Emma and Sophie, needed therapy to process their confusion about their mother's disappearance and the revelation that much of their family life had been built on lies. At 8 years old, they couldn't fully understand the criminal aspects, but they knew their mother had done something very wrong that hurt people they loved. Michael and I worked together to provide them with stability and honest, age-appropriate explanations about why their family situation had changed so dramatically. The community response was overwhelmingly supportive once people understood what had really happened. Neighbors who'd been influenced by Sharon's lies about my mental state apologized and offered help during our family crisis. Mrs. Patterson organized meal deliveries for several weeks while Michael adjusted to single parenthood, and other residents shared their own experiences with suspicious characters who might have been part of similar scams. My relationship with Dr. Martinez required careful repair since Sharon had manipulated him into questioning my mental state. When he learned how he'd been deceived by false information and strategic manipulation, he implemented new protocols for evaluating elderly patients to prevent similar exploitation. Our experience helped expose vulnerabilities in medical systems that criminals can exploit to discredit their victims. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, struggled with shame over how quickly she'd believed Sharon's lies about my mental decline. "I feel terrible for abandoning you when you needed family support most," she said during an emotional conversation weeks later. "I should have known you better than to believe you'd suddenly become paranoid and delusional." Her experience taught us all how easily well-meaning people can become unwitting accomplices to psychological abuse. My brother Frank became one of my strongest advocates after learning how thoroughly he'd been manipulated into betraying my trust. His guilt motivated him to research elder fraud prevention, and he now volunteers with organizations that educate families about protecting vulnerable members from financial predators. Frank's transformation from unwitting accomplice to passionate advocate helped heal our relationship while serving a larger purpose. Eleanor Henderson and her grandson Jake became permanent fixtures in our lives, their support during our crisis creating bonds stronger than blood relationships. Eleanor's sharp instincts and Jake's technical skills had been crucial to exposing Sharon's deception, proving that community connections and intergenerational cooperation can overcome even sophisticated criminal schemes. The legal proceedings provided a sense of justice, but the real satisfaction came from protecting other families from similar victimization. Our case contributed evidence to a federal investigation of elder fraud networks, helping prosecutors build cases against other criminals who target vulnerable families. Knowing that our suffering prevented other people from experiencing similar betrayal gave meaning to our ordeal. Michael has become a devoted single father who appreciates family relationships more deeply after nearly losing them to deception. He moved back into my neighborhood, purchasing a house just 2 blocks away where the girls can easily visit their grandmother while maintaining their own space. Our relationship is stronger now than it was before Sharon's manipulation because we've learned to communicate more directly and trust each other more completely. The experience taught me that family loyalty isn't about blind faith in relatives, it's about having the courage to speak difficult truths when someone you love is in danger. I learned to trust my instincts even when everyone around me insisted I was wrong, and I discovered strength I didn't know I possessed when protecting people I care about required fighting professional criminals. Most importantly, I learned that healing from betrayal requires both justice and forgiveness. Sharon's punishment provided necessary accountability for her crimes, but my own peace came from forgiving Michael's doubt and rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of greater honesty and mutual respect. The chocolate box that started this nightmare now sits in my kitchen as a reminder that small gestures of kindness can reveal enormous truths about the people around us. As I reflect on this experience, I realize that family relationships require constant nurturing and protection from those who would exploit them for personal gain. The bonds between parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren, are precious enough to fight for when threatened by manipulation or deception. My willingness to endure months of isolation and character assassination to protect my son and granddaughters proved that love sometimes requires standing alone until truth prevails. What would I want other families to learn from our experience? Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't immediately prove your concerns. Research people who suddenly appear in your family's financial planning, especially if they discourage questions or rush major decisions. Most importantly, remember that criminals often use our love for family members as weapons against us, counting on our desire to avoid conflict to hide their deceptions. The chocolate box sits on my counter now as a reminder of how quickly life can change and how important it is to protect the people we love from those who would exploit our trust and affection. Every time I see it, I remember that being a grandmother sometimes means being willing to fight battles that others can't or won't fight, standing strong against forces that threaten to destroy everything that matters most. So I ask you, my friends watching from around the world, have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between keeping peace and protecting someone you love? Have you experienced betrayal from people you trusted completely? Share your stories in the comments below, because sometimes knowing we're not alone in these struggles gives us strength to face whatever challenges life brings our way. Please like this video if it resonated with your own experiences, subscribe for more real stories about family, betrayal, and the courage it takes to fight for what's right, and share this with someone who might need to hear that their instincts about family dangers should be trusted, not dismissed. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to stay silent when someone you care about is in danger. May your families be blessed with honesty, protected from deception, and strengthened by the courage to face difficult truths together.